Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we're going to be going through how to create a strength cycle. So this can be basically done for any strength exercise in order to peak our strength and beat our previous personal bests. So first on this sheet here we have basically an overall picture of the training cycle. So assuming we have 16 weeks for this cycle, it could be longer or shorter, but this is just one example. And we're going to create a training cycle over those 16 weeks in order to peak at this 16-week mark. So I've split these 16 weeks here into 4 distinct training blocks. Each of them are 4 weeks long. And I've also got here a visual graph of the volumes and intensities over this 16 weeks. So these are simply arbitrary numbers. They're not exact volumes and intensities, but it's more important to understand the general trend that they're going to follow. So our volume is going to start off higher and gradually decrease throughout the training cycle, whereas intensity is essentially going to do the opposite. The intensity will start out somewhat lower since the volume is higher, and throughout the training cycle, the intensity will gradually increase until it reaches a peak here in the 16th week. Now, the reason that we manipulate the volumes and intensities over the training block is to work on slightly different aspects at different times of the training cycle. So higher volumes are going to lead to greater structural adaptation, so we're going to get more muscle hypertrophy and more tendon and ligament resilience. Whereas higher intensities are going to lead to greater specific neural adaptations. So the higher intensities are basically going to be where we're doing more specific movements and we're going to get more neural adaptations that are specific to that movement that we're doing. Now, the reason we can't do high volumes and high intensities at the same time is because it's simply going to be too much for our body to handle and will actually not improve, will actually regress if we do too much volume and too much intensity at the same time. So we plan earlier in the cycle to do more volume so we get more greater structural adaptation. So we're building basically that base, and the further and further we go along in the cycle, the more we need to peak. We're going to do higher intensities, which is going to really capitalize on all that structural adaptations that we've created and get really specific with the movements and the intensities that we're using. And at this point, the volume has to drop off in order to allow for these higher intensities to be present. So putting this into an actual program, this is an example of how it might look. So we have the 4 distinct blocks that we split the training cycle up into. And in this example, I'm just simply going to do one exercise, and that's going to be the back squat, but this can be done for any exercise. So for example, here we have a 4-week training block, assuming we're going to back squat 2 times per week. This is how it might be planned out. So we know in this final 16th week, we want to really test our max and try and hit a new personal record. So we can work backwards from there. And essentially what I've done is follow that general progression of volume and intensity. And I've basically made that, so from block to block, the volumes go down while the intensity goes up until it peaks at this point. So we're following the paradigm of 3 weeks of overload followed by 1 week of deload. So 1, 2, 3 overload weeks, and the 4th week will be a deload week. So 2 back squat sessions. The first one, we're going to work on slightly higher repetitions, so slightly greater volumes and slightly lower loads, whereas the second session is going to have slightly lower repetitions and therefore slightly greater intensities. So we're undulating that stimulus. And all we're going to do is basically go 4 sets of 6 for the first 3 weeks and basically attempting to overload that slightly week to week. So I picked arbitrary numbers here, maybe for a somewhat intermediate lifter or athlete. So starting on 130 kilos, going to 135 and then to 140, and then dropping the volume down, so dropping a set off and reducing the load back to the same load as the first week in order to give our body a little break. The other day is essentially the same concept, but the repetitions are slightly lower while the load is slightly higher. So 4 sets of 4, 140, 145, 150 kilos, and then drop that off again. Drop 1 set to reduce the volume, and then drop the load back to the load of the first week. Now, it's important to not push yourself to max effort in the first week. Otherwise, the next 2 weeks, you may not be able to present an overload. So basically in week 3, this is going to be the hardest week of each of these blocks. So you want to set yourself up to be able to pretty much work at max intensity, leaving almost no repetitions left in this week 3, which means that in week 1 and 2, we don't want to overestimate what we can do. So 4 sets of 6 at 130 may be fairly conservative, but that's going to build up and give you momentum going into week 3. The second block here is essentially exactly the same concept, but all we have done is we've reduced the sets to reduce the volume slightly and reduce the reps in both weeks. And then simultaneously, we've increased the load slightly. So again, this is just arbitrary increases. I've just put an extra 5 kilos and we're going to wave up in the same way as we did in the last block. So 3 sets of 5, starting at 135, going to 140, then 145 kilos, deloading. Same thing with the second session, working up to 155 for less reps and less sets on this week than the previous block. Exactly the same thing in the third block, drop a set and drop a rep and increase the load and deload again. Then in this final block here, there's a slightly different scenario here. Instead of having a deload, we have a taper. The taper needs to be individual to the athlete in order to get the most out of it. And that's going to come from trial and error, but I've just basically done a generic taper, which is essentially I've just done a deload here, which is going to work somewhat well for the taper anyway. But this time again, we've dropped the sets down to only 1 set per session and very low reps. So this volume is extremely low, but the load is getting very intense. So we're going to do 1 set of 3 up to week 15, starting at 145 and going all the way up to 155. And this one is going to be single. So 1 set of 1. So just working up to a heavy weight for 1 rep, and then that's going to take us to week 15, which we're going to hit 165 for a single. So this week here, we should be hitting at least 90 to 95% of what we think we can max out at. And then finally in week 16, that's where we're going to go for an absolute maximum attempt. I'd just like to point out that this is just one example of how we can write a strength program. There are many ways to do it. But what's important is to have those principles in place. So reducing the volume gradually, starting with higher volumes and reducing that, and slowly increasing the intensity over time until that peaks at a specific time that we need to be peaked for. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.